Hi there, and welcome. I'm Thomas Canavan, the Chief Operating Officer of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial Fund and the Executive Director of the National Law Enforcement Museum. I'm so glad that you're joining us for this special five-part series, Law Enforcement Think Tanks, Shaping the Future of Policing. In these episodes, we'll hear from incredible leaders working behind the scenes to improve law enforcement in ways that we don't often hear about. For many of us, it might seem like policing has always been the way that it is today, but that's far from the truth. What we learn in movies, TV shows, music, and the media rarely captures the full picture. In reality, dozens of organizations led by law enforcement, policy, criminal justice, and public safety experts are constantly shaping and improving the profession. In this series, we'll introduce you to five of these organizations and the leaders behind them. Chris Shung, Executive Director of the Curve, Paul Goldenberg, Senior Fellow at the Miller Center for Policing and Community Resilience at Rutgers University, Ben Heyman, Executive Director of the Center for Public Safety and Justice at the University of Virginia, Jim Beerman, founder of the Future Policing Institute, and Rosa Brooks, co-director of the Center on Innovations and Community Safety at Georgetown University. Each guest brings a unique perspective and decades of experience. Their stories will challenge assumptions, spark new ideas, and highlight the work being done to keep communities safe. Each of our guests' bios and links to their organizations can be found in the episode descriptions. Also, we recorded one introduction for the whole series, so when you start the next episode, you can skip directly to where our conversation begins. Thank you again for joining us today, and enjoy the conversations. Well, thank you, Jim, for joining us today. I'm very excited about the opportunity to speak with you and learn more about your career as well as the Future Policing Institute.
Sure. It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking me.
I want to start with a little bit of background and maybe your education, where you're from. Tell us a little bit
Mhm.
about yourself.
Okay. Well, I got into policing in 1978 and spent my entire, as a cop, part of my career at the Redlands, California Police Department, which is in Southern California, about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. I grew up here, wasn't born here, but my earliest recollection is from Redlands, and I think that's important because it has a lot to do with my policing experience. I am a product of the Redlands public school system, got my bachelor's degree from Cal State San Bernardino, my master's from the University of Redlands. I'm a graduate of the California Command College and the FBI National Academy, among other things.
What was your master's degree in?
It's a master's in management. Today, that would be an MBA, but this was quite a
Oh,
while ago. And my thesis was studying the difference between officers' perception about what motivated them to work and what their immediate supervisors thought motivated them to work. And this would
hmm.
have been in the early 80s. And I found that there was quite a variance in those two. There was a huge difference between what the street cops thought motivated themselves and what their bosses thought motivated them.
And what were those motivations?
So there were multiple dimensions, but essentially, street cops were motivated by the intrinsic value of the work and um, the recognition they got from the agency, and the supervisors thought that they were mostly motivated by the money, even though it wasn't very much back then, um, and more tangible things like that. So it was really interesting. I did it when I was an officer, and
Mhm.
finally finished the um, my thesis, which got amazingly out of control and long when I was lieutenant. So it took me several years to do this, but it was really an interesting experience, just doing
Mhm.
research within my own agency and all that entails, aside
Mhm.
from the research itself.
Yeah, we still see those recruitment bonuses, um, from departments, and I wonder if that thought still exists, that
So
departments that
in
are
California,
motivated by money.
yeah, well, I think money is important. If you understand and believe in a really basic kind of motivational theory, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Many of us have studied that forever. I think it's important enough to meet your basic needs. So you see in policing in California places that there's some agencies whose signing bonus is north of $50,000. There's a couple I think that have hit $100,000. And some of these are in places where the street cop after a couple of years is making like $175,000 a year, which sounds amazing to me. I mean, it's crazy until you look at what the cost of living is. Those particular agencies happen to be up in the Bay Area where the cost of housing is just out of control. So, and those salaries are indexed to that local cost of living, even though most of those cops don't actually live there. They live in someplace else. And um, the Los Angeles area, probably San Diego and the Bay Area, um, are full of cops who are commuters, and they commute quite a ways, right? They're much like in Southern California, the fire service is because of their work schedules. Firefighters typically don't live in the town in which they work, and they don't have to because their schedules. But in Orange County or LA County, for instance, the cost of living is just off the charts. So you see a lot of commuting. There's a lot of LA City, LA County firefighters that live in my town. And like I said, we're when the traffic's good, we're an hour from LA.
Mhm. What initially inspired you to become a police officer?
So when I was 13 years old, I had a little motorcycle and I was putzing around in the front yard one day. And my mom came out and said, look, I don't care if you ride it on the front lawn here, but do not take that thing on the street. And I said, yes, ma'am. She goes back in the house and I promptly take it out on the street because I am convinced I can go down the street, go around the corner, visit my buddy real quick and come back before she figures out what I've done. So I do that. And as soon as I pull into the driveway of my buddy's house, which is only a few blocks away, a police car pulls in behind me because I was not paying at all attention. I was enjoying the freedom of the open road, the wind blowing through my hair and having a great time. I was like easy rider, on my little mini Honda motorcycle. And so I get busted by the cops riding an illegal motorcycle before I'm old enough to have a license. They call my mom. She comes down to pick me up and she's going to kill me. She is so pissed at me right at that moment for, justifiably. But the guy who stopped me was a guy named Jim Smith. And um, I later worked with him. This is, 10 years, fast forward 10 years. And now I'm a cop at Redlands and now I'm working with this guy, he's a sergeant. And later we were captains together and I would remind him of this story, which of course he didn't remember. But I have very, very clear recollections of talking to him. I can, in my mind's eye to this day, I can still see he had a revolver and the bullets were sitting in the little individual bullet holders on his belt. He was wearing a leather jacket with the metal badge on the outside. We didn't have HTs back then, so the radio traffic was from his car was coming out over the speaker, and they had a bubble gum like single red light on the roof of the car. And I have this super clear recollection of how impressed I was, not only with, his gun, because I'm a 13-year-old boy, and the car and his leather jacket and all this stuff, but also the fact that he kept my mom from killing me because he said, look, he did something wrong, so you got to hold him accountable, but you own some of this issue, Mrs. Beerman, by letting a 13-year-old kid on a motorcycle ride around in the front yard unsupervised. What did you think he was going to do? I mean, seriously, this is the early, I don't know, what year was this? I don't know, early 70s. And so she calmed down and, I couldn't ride the bike for a month or so. But as I have reflected on what motivated me to become a cop, I keep going back to that moment where I decided that I'm going to do that. That is for me. I don't know how conscious I was at that moment, but I do know that as I fast forwarded, over the years through my teen years, I kept coming back to that and thinking that's what I want to do. That's the kind of job I want to do. And then as I got older and understood work a little better, I think I really appreciated the challenge of the job and not being in an office. I think was important to me early on. And certainly in the 70s, we recruited in the spirit of adventure, not so much the spirit of service. And being a young 20 something in the late 70s, that appealed to me a great deal. With the passage of time, I think I came to appreciate that the spirit of service is as important, if not more so, in policing than the spirit of adventure. But sure was fun. I have to say that.
Yeah.
Had a
And,
great career.
and so
I'd do it
while
again.
you,
I'd do it again in 2 seconds.
yeah. And while you were there at Redlands, you held every position within the unit. What was your career like there at Redlands?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. I came into policing, I guess, when there was a lot of movement. There was a lot of movement within the agency for all kinds of reasons. There was a lot of cultural change, so I was able to work every aspect of patrol and investigation, narcotics, and as a lieutenant, I ran a team we did a bunch of stuff. And we had a kind of rotational scheme, so I was able to move through the organization and got to see every aspect of policing, which became important for me later on when I became the chief, because I had a much more granulated view of these complicated organizations called police departments. I wasn't a records clerk and I wasn't a dispatcher, but I filled in for dispatch. Frequently, I spent a lot of time in the record section talking to people because of the physicality of the building that we were in at the time. Um, and I do have a great appreciation for the fact that police departments or sheriff's departments are really examples of, when they're well functioning anyway, of systems thinking, right? They are not a collection of parts, they're a system. And if the dispatchers don't work in concert with the patrol officers, and if those two groups don't work in concert with the records people or the investigators or whoever, then it just doesn't work, right? People don't get filed on, the reports don't get done, you don't get to calls, et cetera, et cetera. So um, having that experience of working in or with each of those units, I think gave me a better sense of all of that.
Mhm. Did you have a particular favorite aspect of the department or a particular time that you enjoyed?
Well, I love patrol. I mean, I to this day, if they'd let me, I'd strap on a gun in a car and go out and go on patrol again. But the job that was probably the wildest and most crazy fun was when the 5 years or so I worked narcotics and
Mm,
undercover stuff. That was, especially back then, that was in that point, that was in the mid 80s. And it was just a crazy time all the way around.
mhm,
California was experiencing a lot of violence and huge drug problem. And so we were busy all the time.
mhm,
It's not a great way of life. It's, I think very, very hard. It was very hard on my wife,
mhm,
probably very hard on me physically, but man, it was a lot of fun, I have to say.
mhm, mm. And how did serving in each of those roles contribute to your leadership style? How do you think that developed over time? And do you think you approach it differently than others?
Well, I don't know if I approach it differently than others. I mean, there's an aspect of what we did at the police department that is unique that probably caused me to think a little differently about this thing called policing. But working, excuse me, in all of these different units, I think gave me an appreciation for how hard all of these people were working, regardless of their position. Whether it was the maintenance guy, the evidence technician, the dispatcher, the records clerk, whomever, what their challenges were. And um, my, if I had to, I don't know that I had or have any one particular leadership style. It's probably more democratic than autocratic and participative than autocratic, I guess. But I truly believe that the role of a good leader is to serve their people. So maybe being a servant leader, I guess, would encapsulate that a little bit. But if you don't have a sense of empathy for the challenges that people have within the organization, and I don't know how you facilitate their success, right? If you don't understand that, and I think this is really important agents or an organization like a police department where traditionally the members of that organization that carry guns and have badges tend to count more than other people. But that's a cultural thing, right? That's a choice that we make subconsciously or not. And it doesn't really make any sense if you think about it, because I don't know how patrol officers would ever get the call and respond to the right place if you didn't have people called dispatchers. And we'll never prosecute criminals based on the arrest and the reports the cops write if you don't have records clerks. So
Mm,
everybody's participation in public safety within a police department count, and they count as much as each other, I think. And I would extend that to volunteers. We had a very large volunteer contingent at the police department. We had a lot of civilian employees. We had,
mm,
um, at one point, we had more civilian employees than we had sworn officers because of our policing model, which probably
mhm,
affected more of my thinking about policing today than anything, was the structure and the mission of the police department, which
mhm.
was unique.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight the additional role that you had, and this may touch on the policing model, but as the director of housing,
Mhm.
recreation, and senior services. So I think at the time, from what I read, that was a pretty innovative move to combine, that department agency with the police department. Could you talk a little bit about that, how that came about,
Sure.
and I think when you mentioned the volunteers, the civilian roles, that's connected to this as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I think we got to the civilian piece and the volunteer piece a little bit differently. But
Mm,
so in the mid to late 90s, we had for us, a very high level of youth violence. And the majority of our murders and gun assaults were being committed by young people, by juveniles. And I think there was a belief among the executive staff that whatever we had been doing for years and years just wasn't working, and because we couldn't seem to control that no matter what we did. Um, I had been doing a lot of thinking about this. I was a captain when we started down this road,
mm,
and I was sitting in a United Way meeting, and I was sitting. We were talking about youth violence, I think, at this meeting, and I was happened to be sitting next to the tobacco alcohol education coordinator for the school district, and she happened to say to me, "Well, this sounds a lot like risk and protective focus prevention." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about? I've never even heard that phrase." So she goes off and explains this to me, and it dawns on me that what she has just described is actually a community policing violence reduction initiative. Um, so she tells me, who the researchers are. They happen to be at the University of Washington, Seattle. I cold call them. One thing leads to another, and we take that model called risk and protective focus prevention and adapt it to the police department. And that model simply says that
mm,
there are, based on the science around adolescent problem prevention, and those five problem behaviors are delinquency, violence, substance abuse, dropping out of school, and teen pregnancy. So those are the five behaviors that this particular model looks at. And there are multiple domains inside of each of those, like community, family, um, school, right? And inside of each of those domains are these things called risk factors that are measurable. And based on the longitudinal studies that these researchers and others had been involved in, they were very clear that when young people aggregate the amount of risk in their lives, things like when your parents are involved in the problem behavior, when you experience early academic failure, when you move a lot around a community, those are risks in each of those domains that when they aggregate, you start to see them precipitate these five problem behaviors. So it is almost impossible, I think, to predict human behavior. but you can create probabilities. So you can say that when a young person has 7 or more of these risk factors in their life, they're in a 90% probability of experiencing violence or substance abuse or and dropping out of delinquency, let's say. So this made a lot of sense to me conceptually. We went and did a deep dive into the backgrounds of both the um, murder victims and the murder suspects in these cases over many years, and just our not scientific research or evaluation of this immediately showed us that all of these kids were experiencing, that we could identify just from the case files, probably somewhere between 8 and 10 of these identified risk factors. So this made a lot of sense to us as a operating philosophy that we should pursue this. We then said, okay, what are the opposite of risk factors, or these things called protective factors that serve to mitigate the impact of the risk factors? And all of this, by the way, is based on a public health model for reducing cardiovascular disease. This is how this country reduced the level of cardiovascular disease, by identifying and reducing risk factors like smoking and diets high in fat, lack of exercise, and increasing protective factors. Don't smoke, get good exercise, eat well, right? These are the two sides of that particular coin, to make a very simple view. So we said, this is what we're going to do. The chief at the time, a great guy who absolutely was committed to this idea, I said, go forth and do it. So I put together this plan and met with the city council, because we realized we didn't have enough tools in our organizational toolbox to do this. We needed tools to be able to mitigate risk factors in the community domain or the family domain or whatever. So we convinced the city to consolidate into the police department the housing, recreation, senior service, code enforcement. We already had animal control. That's probably not part of this model, but we put all of those tools into the police department. Now, that didn't mean that the cops did housing programs or that they did recreation programs. It meant that the organizational experience of problem solving and getting stuff done, right? Police agencies have a real distinct bias for action, transferred to these basic city services that had heretofore been independent. Now they were part of the police department. Those civilian employees at those other agencies came over as civilian employees of the police department. And we were able to use our traditional police department resources, whether those were community policing grants from the cops office or our crime analysis unit, for instance, which we renamed to the community analysis unit, because we discovered that we could map all of this stuff. So we mapped risk and protective factors and did all this crazy stuff. And within a year or two, saw a 50% reduction in the violence in the areas where we're concentrating all of these services in this effect. And compared to the rest of the city, this is a long-winded explanation, but it's kind of hard to explain easily in a short way. So, for instance, we used the housing money that was available to us to help attack one of the risk factors called community disorganization. And we would give housing grants to people who were homeowners to rehabilitate the exterior of their house, clean up the yards, do all these kinds of things, right? So our housing people would go out and say, hi, we're from the police department. We're here to give you $25,000 to rehab your house. Now, initially, that kind of freaked people out. They did not believe that that was true, because that was not a traditional police function, right? Or we would take the recreation programs out to the neighborhoods where kids were that were not accessing the community center, because to get there, they had to walk through a lot of high crime, gang infested areas. So we had a big mobile communication bus, which became a tutorial center. And we had a cop who was a race car driver who would bring his race car out sometimes, but the recreation staff would because we're the police, we can close off the roads, and that's what we did, and that became the playground, right? In these neighborhoods, we close off the roads and do things. So it changed how the community perceived the police department. It changed how the cops perceived our own mission, and it certainly changed my view of what the purpose of policing is and what we can do as cops and as a police department, and certainly as a police chief with a bully pulpit in the community to address things that we know or suspect what the cause is, but we don't have the existing tools to do with it. So it was really interesting. We created a community collaborative that is still running today. And even though we created it after it got its sea legs, we handed it off and to the community leaders that wanted to run it, and they're still around today. So I don't know, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that it just changed my perspective on policing. I've had several perspective changing experiences as a cop, and then later as a police leader. This was one of them. Working dope was another one, right? It gave me a very clear understanding of where people, kids that have all these risk factors end up. How do they, the question is, when I would be sitting there at midnight buying dope with these informants who were actually pretty smart and personable people, I'd say, how'd you end up here? And they tell me their life story. And you just hear the same thing. The names change, but it's the same story over and over. And it starts when they're kids. And at some point you could say, this is where you're going to end up. Without some intervention, you're likely to be here. You're way in that, 90th percentile of problem behavior. The other probably really substantial perspective changing experience I had was at the FBI National Academy when I took a class on future studies and future of policing, and that has directly resulted in where I am in what I'm doing today. I don't know if that
So,
explained it all. It's a long story. It's kind of weird for a lot of police leaders. They look at that. I had several police chiefs kind of look at me and scratch their head. But at the time, we were not the only agency where recreation was part of the police department. There were a couple of other agencies in California, and I think that has stopped. And there's a push and a pull around that issue of the police are already asked to do too many things. Why would you give them more things to do, right? And I think all of that gets back to the fundamental question that most communities, and I think this country, is not really clear on. And that is, what's the purpose of policing? What's the true purpose of policing? And there are efforts, I think, underway and have been for a while to try to answer that. But I think it's much more than enforcing our laws. We use the term law enforcement, right? That's part of our culture. And if you're in the business, you know that it means more than that. But I think for a lot of people, that conveys that, well, you enforce the law. Yeah, you're right. That's exactly what cops do. But for the most part, that is not the majority of how they spend their time. When you do an analysis of how most cops spend most of their time, you realize it's on conflict resolution and preventing crime and other things, not arresting people or writing people tickets, even though we think of it that way and many times. And, that may not even be what the community in which a police department exists wants from them. So trying to determine this, I think, has been a challenge for a lot of people. And for us in Redlands, it was really about preventing crime before it occurred. And that was the model we used to do that.
when just go back to the mapping aspect of the risk factors, were you identifying neighborhoods or individuals, victims of crimes or offenders?
All of the above. All of the above. So hotspots policing is a big deal for us. It was such a big deal. In fact, we got rid of our beat assignments and we no longer had beats. We had dynamic, I think we called it dynamic beat restructuring. But what we would do is at the beginning of a patrol team's work week, the sergeant would get maps that showed where the hotspots were for the prior week for their shift. And then during the briefing, the sergeant would assign those hotspots to the officers and say, okay, Joe, you've got this one here, because everybody had the map, right? You get this area, you get that area, you get that area. And this was all connected to our belief in evidence-based policing, right? Which I think is a fundamental mental model that every police department should be using in this country. But it was a reflection of saying, this is what our data shows us where crime is, and that's where I want you to go. So um, that created another issue, which was many of the influential people in our town lived in areas where there wasn't crime, but they had the ear of the council. So if I take the cops out of those areas, put them into the areas where there's a lot of crime, how am I going to not get myself in political hot water, right? So that's where we started expanding our uniformed volunteer force, which
Mm,
was called is to this day still called the Citizen Volunteer Patrol, or CVPs for short.
mhm,
And for the first probably 10 years or so of that unit's existence, it never was greater than maybe 20 people or so. When we realized we needed to dramatically expand this, it grew to 100, and it got even bigger than that when in the first decade of the century, 2006, 7, 8, right around in that period, we suffered great financial challenges at the city. So we lost a third of the department, and that caused us to then dramatically increase the number of volunteers. We went from that 30 number, which had been static for a long time, to almost 400 volunteers. And we literally had them in
mm.
every aspect. We had more volunteers than we had employees at the police department for quite a while.
Wow.
Um, so we would use the same kind of mapping. So our crime analysis unit was quite robust to say, okay, here's where the crimes are. That shows us also where the crimes are not. And we created maps around that. Here's the lack of crime. And this is where we put our volunteers. So they were in marked cars. They looked different than the police cars. The uniforms they had were different, but it still said Redlands Police on the side. And when people saw it in these volunteers driving in their neighborhoods, they knew there was a police presence there, that were on they were on our radio system, right? So they could pick up the radio in their car or on their belt and say, I got a problem. And that's how we kind of balance this. How do we focus on where the crime is with the people who are charged, and the only people within the agency that could actually arrest you and had the training and the tools to do that, and not lose connection to the powerful community expectation that they're safer when they see a police car go driving by, right? Or there's people in the neighborhood. They would also do these things. They're pretty simple, right? Vacation house checks. And when I was a street cop, we would have to do those, but over time, we just didn't have the officers didn't have time to do them, so had stopped doing them for a long time. And when we ramped up these volunteers, that's who did them. And so if you were on vacation and you told us you were gone, we would check your house 2 or 3 times a day, right? With
Oh,
these
wow.
volunteers, and they would drop off these little cards in your under your door or someplace where people couldn't see them, that said we came by and everything looked okay. And I can't even tell you how much people appreciated that. It was just we didn't intend it as a customer service kind of a thing, but I think it ended up that way. We were just trying to provide a higher level of service and give our volunteers something meaningful to do. And, a couple times they found burglaries that had yet to be reported, and
Mhm,
found problems at the houses, and we were able to do stuff
mhm.
about it and help people. So, and
So,
and not we did that, I would point out, without affecting the officers' time. Right, it had nothing to do with the street cops. Those services did not impact the street cops at all. Same thing with our housing, recreation, or senior service program.
the uh the move to the hotspots
Mhm.
patrol, before that, when you're just doing, I guess, kind of the traditional beat patrol, was that just evenly assigned, across the city? Like, how was that different than the hotspot approach?
Well, so for all of my career until we did this, the city was divided up into um, 7 geographic beats. And we would always struggle with those, right? Because we were always looking at them from a workload distribution compared to our available workforce approach. And I don't know how many times we changed that. Underlying that layer that remained even after we got rid of the beats was a grid system, a reporting grid system. And that's how we were able to tell the computer certain things, when we're trying to pull data out of our CAD RMS. We usually did it via the grid because those were very small blocks, right? I mean, they literally might only be 3 or 4 square blocks. Um, but when we went, so our evolution was we first understood and embraced evidence-based policing. That was the first step. You got to get that piece right. I think when you do that, then you start looking around for, what are your problems and how do you address your problems and what are the best models that have the most rigorous science and have proven repeatedly to be effective. And there are probably few policing strategies as effective as hotspots, policing based on the number of rigorous scientific evaluations of the effectiveness of that model. So that's the thing we looked at for how do we decide how we're deploying our patrol forces. There's no evidence that I'm aware of, with the exception of in-progress calls, that getting to a routine call for service quickly has any reduction in crime impact. We are driven, and this is mostly a political construct, I think, we are driven in policing by these things called response times. And the emergency response time, in my view, has much more value than the non-emergency response time from a save people's lives, catch the bad guys kind of perspective. But from in a political context, both emergency and non-emergency response times have job retention implications for the police chief, right? It's a political component because people believe if I call you, I have an expectation you'll be here in a reasonable amount of time. And regardless of what that call for service is, but that doesn't make any sense. So part of the way we address that is we hired a bunch of civilian report takers and called community service officers. Those are not unique, but we could hire 2 CSOs for the same cost of hiring 1 cop.
Hmm.
So, and they were professional report takers. They did all the forensics except on the most serious crimes. So we actually, by rethinking how we were going to use cops, we created this was our own reimagining policing, I guess, on some level. We created this new class of employee for us who got hired with the expectation that all they're going to do is take reports and investigate crimes that don't have suspects present and are not of the really serious type, right? They didn't investigate armed robberies or rapes or murders or felonious assaults, and they didn't handle anything that was in progress. But they took all the theft reports, the auto theft reports, the auto theft recovery, and residential burglaries and commercial burglaries. And in doing so, they'd all been trained in forensics. So the level of forensic science services that we were providing jumped dramatically because we had an experience with trying to teach cops how to take photographs and do fingerprinting. And that was okay, I guess, but it didn't result in many identifications of criminal suspects or prosecutions. When we went to the civilian model, those things jumped right off the chart because these people were actually good at lifting latent prints, which then got people identified. And, we would recognize that and we tracked all of that. And so our forensic capacity jumped dramatically as a result of having people who got hired with the expectation this is what they're going to do, and then left the cops to do, for the most part, what most of them thought they were going to do when they took the job or what they wanted to do. I don't know many cops who say, well, I wanted to be a cop so I could take a late reported
Mhm.
theft report of a bicycle off somebody's front porch and they have no idea when it was stolen and they have no idea who did it. That generally doesn't float many cops' boats,
Mhm.
right? They're there to do an important job that only they can do. So when we isolated them to those things, it- I think their job satisfaction went up
Mhm.
and our customer service, the quality of our customer service went up dramatically. There
Mhm.
are implications and ramifications of doing this. We discovered that we were losing some investigative skill sets in the patrol world
Mhm.
because the cops weren't taking those kinds of reports anymore, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So that was a bit of a challenge. I mean, there's no perfect model out there, I think. But when we back to the hotspots thing, um, we really thought that um, I was a big fan of crime analysis. I spent a lot of time with the National Institute of Justice. So long before I retired and took the job in DC, I'd spent time with the National Institute of Justice and the cops office around a lot of mapping initiatives. This was back when GIS was really exploding and the world of crime analysis was exploding as a result of that. Um, so I had a great appreciation for that. That's why probably another reason that hotspots policing made so much sense because it's a very visual strategy, right? You're looking at a map. That's where the hotspots are. Go there. It's kind of like if if you like to fish and somebody gives you the secret map where the fish and game people are stocking the streams with fish, and you want to catch fish. Well, go there, right? Go to where the fish are. Go to where the crooks are. Go to where the crime is. We did a couple of tests as an experiment internally about asking cops, giving them a blank map and saying, tell us where you think the crime was versus where it actually was. And I was pleasantly surprised that they got most of it right, but they were wrong about a lot of stuff, right? And it's just because human beings can't assimilate that much tabular data. It's just not possible, right? That's why we're visual animals, and that's why mapping and pictures make so much sense. So when we did this, it was a challenge at first because we were so used to having beats. But when we really talked about it, we realized we were pulling people off their beats all the time to handle calls. So at the end of the day, the only thing the beats made any sense for was the workload distribution about reports, right? You take your
Mhm.
reports in this area, you take the problem with that model is that if you were working a slow area, you took very few reports. If you were working a busy area, you got hammered, right? And so there was an issue of fairness around that workload distribution. So going to this hotspot thing meant we created a very different approach to how we handed out those radio assignments that or CAD assignments, I guess, that resulted in the cops having to take paper, right? It was an entirely different approach to do things. And they've continued doing this today. I mean, it's not perfect. I mean, there are issues with all of these models, but it did help us focus on the idea that most crime occurs in a very small number of very small places, right? So when
Mhm.
you look, so we would use the hotspots map would create these blobs on the map, right? But if you were to really look deep, you're really getting down to what are called street segments, which are just a block between this street and this street, right? Kind of a thing. They get focused on hot places. So there's this idea: you have hot spots, you have hot places, you have hot people, right? And I think you have now, this day and age, I would include in all of that from a leadership perspective, you have hot issues too, things that create more problems for the leadership or the organization overall than other things do, right? It's like the 80-20 rule, right? In any organization, 80% of your problems are caused by 20% of your people. So how do you deal with those? This is very similar for hotspots. Policing, at least half of your crime in almost every city occurs in about 5% of places. So these very small places produce a disproportionate amount of problems. And when you are inside of those hot spots, you find that it's really even a small number of physical places like a motel or an apartment building or a house that has a few people who are creating these problems, right? So you can get very focused in this. And this is, I think, the basis of this model called focused deterrence, which is really about identifying those people who are creating all the problems and trying to deal with them, and trying not to spend a whole lot of time dealing with other people who are not really creating serious problems. And when you start messing with them by writing them tickets and doing other things, and it creates other kinds of dynamics and problems, and it diverts you away from the true bad actors in the community that you really should try to deal with.
Going back to when the police department was managing the housing, recreation, and senior services, when all those things started to become more integrated, what was the response from the community and some of the results?
So the community loved it. I mean, it actually created some political problems for me because I had several council members complain to me that the police department had become so popular that they didn't use the word jealous, but it was obvious they were jealous. And because when I had access to those tools, right, that had never been part of the police department before, we were able to do things that were very popular in the community and solved many problems that um, we had heretofore never been able to address. And now that we were addressing it, and because we're the police department, I think police departments have this, as I said earlier, this real distinct bias for action. They just get stuff done, right? In many areas that had languished um, because of their own either organizational inertia or the bureaucracy, we were able to just cut through that and say, okay, we're not going to get this done in 3 months. We're going to do it in 3 days. By Friday, we're going to have this done. Because that's, you don't have, when you're responding to a burglary spree or a robbery spree or an in progress call, you don't have the luxury in policing to say, well, we're really kind of busy right now. So could you guys just kind of, you crooks, hang out for a week or so until we can get our ducks in a row, because we will schedule your arrest for like next Thursday. It doesn't work that way, right? That's ridiculous. But that's how the rest of government works. And so when we overlaid our sense of urgency about life, I guess, and just getting stuff done, it really changed the dynamics of things. And then when we started integrating our crime analysis unit, which I think I said we renamed to the community analysis unit, and then not only renamed it, but we repositioned its mission to look at the broader community and try to figure out what was going on. Crime is not an isolated thing. It's usually connected to many other causes and factors. And so giving our analysts this charge to think about crime differently, produce different results, which we were able to do things. I mentioned that senior services were part of what we did. And so we would overlay the SARA model that's part of problem-oriented policing on these other departments. And one of them was one of the issues that we tried to grapple with was the lack of transportation for low income seniors in our community. And that was problematic. And also connected to that was the lack of connectedness and safety that many of these elderly people had that didn't have family. So they were living by themselves and had no real connection. So using the SARA model, we said, okay, here's the problem. How are we going to solve this? What are we going to do? We managed to get a medical group to donate like a 12 passenger bus. I talked the city into funding some bus drivers, and we created our own senior transportation system, and that we would drive you around free of charge if you were in this category, and take you to doctor's appointments, take you shopping, do whatever. And then we created a program called Never Alone, where we had a bank of volunteers who would call these people that were housebound or alone or whatever and chat with them. Within the first week of us doing that, one of the volunteers couldn't get a hold of this woman that she had been assigned. So we sent an officer out there to do a welfare check and found that she had fallen the day before and broken her hip, and she couldn't get to a phone. And had we not done that, she would have died. Clearly, it was during the summer. It gets really hot around here,
Mhm.
and she couldn't get to a phone. She didn't have anybody checking on her, but it was because we had set this up that her volunteer, I guess is the way to think about that, knew something was wrong, and that's how we were able to get out there and find out what happened. So we saved her life. We're doing this. I mentioned that sometimes the politicians got a little cranky about this stuff because have become so popular, right? For many reasons that had nothing to do with crime fighting. I'm sitting in this coffee house talking to the mayor at the time, and I have my back to this particular window he's looking at that's overlooking a street, and one of our buses goes by, and he says, "Why, see that thing right there? That drives me nuts." And I, "What are you talking about?" He says, "See on the side it says Redlands Police Senior Transportation Program." He says, "Why does it have to say Redlands Police?" I said, "I don't know, because it's a police vehicle. That's what we do. We put police on it. I don't know." He says, "Well, that really bugs me because everybody thinks you guys do everything." And I didn't respond to it in the way I wanted to. He's like, "Well, maybe it's because we
Yeah.
do." But I said, "If this drives you nuts, I'll take police off it. I don't care." I said, "What I care about is that vehicle shows up at Mrs. Jones' house, gives her a ride to the grocery store and back, right? That's what I care about." So we had to take the name off, right, to placate that particular politician. But this is the problem when in a community, when you are doing things where you become so popular, and it wasn't me, I'm talking about the department,
Mhm.
there are implications, right?
Mhm.
Because even though policing is supposed to be apolitical, police chiefs live in a political world, and you have to be politically astute. And just because you think you're doing the right thing and you are doing the right thing does not mean you still can't get whacked by politicians who
Mhm.
think you're just too popular. You get out ahead of your city council, you're going to have a problem. You get out ahead of your city manager, you might have a problem if you're a police chief. And
Yep.
I don't know, maybe because I grew up in the town, I was a bit insensitive to some of that stuff. I just did what I thought we were supposed to be doing, and
Right.
so
Yeah. I think it's a good rule for anybody. You don't want to get out in front of your boss. That doesn't work
it
well.
is. But you have to balance that with the whole purpose that you get a paycheck is to serve the public if you're a police chief, right, and protect it. And this is one of the things that nobody really teaches you about being a police chief until you take that role, that you learn that you're going to be challenged at times because you know what you have to do to keep your community safe, or you know what is right. That may not be the politically astute move.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then you have a decision to make, right?
Mhm.
And
Sure. Yep.
I probably because I grew up here and I knew so many people, but or maybe, I don't know, maybe I've always been this way. I had, and I still have, a very high tolerance for risk and ambiguity. So I would do what I thought was right and then worry about it. As I got smarter, I figured out I could probably still do what I thought was right and worry about it later, and bring my political bosses into the mix earlier in the process, right? Um, I suspect that the adage of "it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission" drove many of my organizational change decisions and innovation decisions a little more than it probably should have.
Yeah. Do you have any before I want to move over into your work with NIJ
Yeah,
and the National Policing Institute. But before we get off of your role at Redlands, any challenges that you wish you would have been able to solve before leaving your role there, and any advice for
yeah.
today?
Well, I have many. I mean, I don't have many regrets, but there are many things that um, the agency's not doing today that I wish they had,
Hmm.
um, based on the number of people who have commented to me how different things are. I think there's a large segment of the community that like that policing model and wish we could still do it. Some parts of it couldn't exist because the law changed around housing issues, for instance, in California.
Mhm.
But I think if I could go back in time, I'd spend a little more time thinking about the sustainability of certain philosophies that we had. So one of them, for instance, that was changed by my successor. Um, I personally believe that women belong in police work and have a great place in policing. I don't even know how to say this and not make it sound like I'm pandering to women in policing. They have a place that is as equal as men do. But there's a biological reality for humans in that is that women have to have the babies, right? So when you're talking to women officers who want to have a family, um, the playing field is inherently not level, right? It just isn't. So um, we had a lot of women officers at the department. Um, I would try to spend time with them and say, "Look, and I'm a dude. You know, I have no idea what it's like to be a woman a cop. So why don't you tell me?" These were kind of the
Mhm.
themes of many of our conversations, and as a result of that, it was really apparent that we were the system. I guess our system was compelling women officers that had had children while they were, let's say, patrol officers, especially, to make a decision between their kids and the job, right? Do I spend more time with my kid, especially when they're really young, or do I go back to work after 3 months or whatever it was that we were able to give them? So I had a conversation with the California Commission on Peace Officer Standard Training and said, so let me ask you guys a question about how many hours a week do cops have to work to retain their certification with you? And they said it's 21. And I said, so as long as they work 21 hours a week, they remain cops. They said, yep. So then I went to the HR director, who was very helpful, and my boss. And ultimately, I don't know if we ever actually took it to the city council. We may have, but we just did this. We created a program for all officers, men and women. Mostly women accessed it, but it was available to men if they had family health issues or some legitimate concern, where they could work 21 hours a week and essentially kind of shift to a part-time mode for a
Mhm.
reasonable amount of time. And by reasonable amount of time, it could be 3 or 4 years.
Mm.
That dramatically increased the number of women candidates, by the way, and applicants we were getting when this word got out.
Mm.
But it also kept several of those women officers told me, had we not done that, they would have left after they had kids. Because there's just so many challenges for women while they're pregnant, after they have the kid, especially if they're in uniform at the time, right? If they're working the street. But there are also issues. We had one male officer whose wife had a serious illness, and when we did this, I had conversation with some of the guys. I said, "So what happens if your kid gets pediatric cancer and the outcome is not going to be good? Would you and you come to me and say, 'Hey, I really need to spend the next 6 months or year spending more time with my kid, saying goodbye than that. Do you want me to say yes or no? What do you want me to say to that? Do you want me to tell you, I'm sorry, but you're working patrol, and so you got to work 40 hours a week, and this is what you're going to do. And the fact that your kid's dying is not really my problem. Or would you rather say, tell me how I can facilitate your success? Tell me how I can support you. Tell me how I can help you through what's going to be the worst period of your life?" Um, Obviously, the answer is the latter, right? So it was open to everybody, and I think this is one reason we didn't have problems selling this internally. We acknowledged that it was probably going to be accessed mostly by women, but it wasn't a woman sent specific program. It was open to anybody in the agency, right? Our goal was to make help our employees' personal lives work while they were working for the police department, whatever that meant. And we would take it on a case by case basis. So um, it meant a lot more work. I mean, it's not easy to do that kind of stuff, but I think it did create a different model. After I left, after I retired, they did away with that because the perspective was a more from an outside leader was a more traditional one that says, if you're a cop, this is what you work, this is what you do. And if you can't
Mm,
hack it, then it's not my problem. I think, especially this day with the generation of workers that are coming into the business, you police leaders just have to think differently. And I think most, no, I don't know if it's most of them. I don't know what that number would be. A lot of them, maybe most of them, recognize this and are trying to think differently about this. I just think you really have to focus on the outcome you seek, which is, for us, it was the retention of our employees, the service to our employees, and the recruitment of new employees based on this model. And then you work backward from that, right? I think this is one of the fundamental challenges in probably all city services, but certainly policing, is trying to find agreement on the outcomes you seek, get clarity on those outcomes. And then when you have that clarity and agreement, then it becomes so much simpler to figure out what the strategy is going to be to achieve those outcomes, what resources you need, what is it you have to do that. And this directly connects to thinking about the future, which is kind of what floats my boat these days.
do you think having been from that community and serving that community for as long as you did gave you the opportunity to be more creative
Uh,
in these situations? I mean, I'm
Yeah,
wondering if
yeah,
a new leader is coming in and they don't kind of have the, that collateral within the community, that it would be hard
yeah.
to imagine some of these solutions.
So I think on the front end of that kind of organizational innovation, it is certainly helpful to have been from the community because I knew so many people, right? And it was, the discussions were easier. I think after me, it would not have been hard at all to continue those kinds of innovations because we've been doing it, right? So that would have been very simple.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think for an outside leader coming in, you can still do all of that. You just have, it is, um, the challenges are around people getting to know and trust you, right? So trust, I think trust and confidence is probably one of the biggest issues that is um, frequently misunderstood in the world of policing, and how you go about creating trust and confidence in people, um, and in a community, especially with communities that don't necessarily have a great deal of trust in you to begin with, or they don't know you, is important. So I think for new chiefs coming in from the outside, they spend the first year or two just trying to get their own sea legs around the organization, but also in the community, and get to a place where people know and trust them. And it's a lot of work for an outside chief to come in and do that, because they're, not only are they getting to learn the agency, they're trying to learn the community and establish things. Sometimes that's better. Every city is different, right? Every community is different. If policing has not been going well, then that outside chief could be the breath of fresh air. But
Right.
then you are employing the skills hopefully you learned. I don't think we do a good job in this country of teaching police chiefs at scale some fundamental skills they need, and one of those is about change management, right? How do you go about articulating some future or desired change, and then going about and doing it, right? How do you strategize around it? How do you articulate it? How do you communicate about it? There's a lot of things that I think our training of leaders in this country, police leaders in this country, is just missing completely. So you learn it on the job, you learn it other ways of finding this stuff out. But none of the things that we did required that they be done by somebody who grew up in that town, right? I mean, it made it easier. There's no
Mhm.
doubt about that. But I didn't invent these theories. I didn't invent hotspots policing. I didn't
Right.
invent crime analysis or all that stuff. All of that existed, and it is there. The challenge is creating this mental model for people about what is the purpose of policing in this community? What are the community expectations? Can we agree on these outcomes around public safety? And if we agree on them, here's our plan to achieve those outcomes. And can you do that planning and create that plan in conjunction with the community, right? A friend of mine calls this community-led policing. And I think that makes a lot of sense, right? It's a very participative model. I mean, you think about Most police leaders, I think, today would say that they're participative leaders and they bring their people along with stuff. And then the next question is, are you doing the same kind of strategizing with the community? Do you bring the community along with you and get their input about what are the things you think we should be focusing on? You're not asking the community members to tell you how to handle a active shooter, right? Or to investigate a murder or whatever. That's not the kind of thing we're saying. What are the things you want us to focus on? What does a perfect police department look like in your view? That's the aspirational model. And where are we today? And is there a disconnect between those two? This is what would cause people in a community to love us that don't love us right now. This is where we are. Can we morph into that and still retain um, the dignity of the police department, the nobility of policing? You can't do this stuff at the expense of the cops.
Mhm.
And it's long-term work. I mean, I think one of the challenges in policing today is how short-term most police leaders tenure is. In California, I think it's 3 or 4. The typical chief lasts 3 to 5 years. That's a very
Wow.
typical tenure, and then they're gone. And in many places, it's more than that. There's a city next to mine that while I was the one chief for 13 years, when I left, they had just hired their 6th chief during that same period.
Wow.
When that happens, first of all, you're never getting much buy-in from the workforce because if they don't like what you're doing, they just wait you out. They know you're not going to be there very long, so they just wait you out.
Mhm.
And that's a problem because that develops a great deal of cynicism among the workforce of really good people who, if they understood what you were trying to do and why you were trying to do it and what's in it for them, then I think that makes a lot of sense. The what's in it for them, I think, is missing from so many of our conversations of police, if you want to call it reform or police change or innovation. Sometimes they get it because if it makes a cop's life easier, they get that. But trying to connect the size of their paycheck to a community policing reform issue is a bit more abstract and takes a little more talking. We spent a lot of time talking about that. Me and the union spent a lot of time, the union leadership, talking about what the community perception was about the raises and their benefit packages and et cetera. And did they support the council giving you more money and better benefits because they like the union or because they are thinking about the activities and the services and the performance of the police department? And most people have um, no real understanding of the distinction between those two. If you're in a state that has police unions, there's the union and then there's the department. These are two separate entities that are intertwined, but people support an increase to the cops, not because of the union, but because of what they perceive the performance or the challenges are of the police department. And so
Mhm.
it's a good, healthy relationship between the department leadership, I think, and the union is kind of a symbiotic one, right? And having that discussion about what's in it for them, either altruistically or financially or self-benefit perspective, has to go directly hand in hand to the why of things. There's a lot of talk about what's your why, right? People talk about that.
Mhm.
What's your why, which is really about what's your personal purpose. But I think there's the 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 issue of purpose in a police department is hugely unanswered. I think in many places we take the superficial answer. I said earlier that it's about law enforcement, and policing is about so much more than law enforcement. Um, and I think that that's the same kind of a conversation you have to have with people about here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's what's in it for you. And that could be because you're going to be a better public servant, or it could be you're going to be safer, you're going to be
Mhm.
healthier, you're going to be whatever. And that last piece, what's in it for me, I think is missing from so much of leadership, articulation and communication around change in policing.
So, wanted to talk about next the roles that you took after your time at Redlands,
Hmm.
but a little bit about that transition what made you interested in continuing to work within law enforcement after your
Right.
time as a chief?
So I retired in the summer of 2011. I apparently don't do retirement well, and I have great admiration for those who do. I have a lot of friends. Of all of my cohort, I think I'm probably the only person who's still working, and I'm at once envious and uh, very respectful of what my colleagues have done in terms of their um, lives post policing. Right, they have figured out how to do that. That's just not me. I have I retired, tried to figure out what it was I wanted to do within a very short period of time. Um, I knew I needed not to be a police chief at that moment. My body had worn out. I think my brain had worn out a bit. Certainly, it had taken its toll on my wife. Um, it's a tough job. It's kind of can be bare knuckle politics when you're a police chief at times. And I had been a police chief much longer than um, the average tenure of police chief in California. Maybe too long. One of the things I think that it would be great to think about in policing is to give police chiefs sabbaticals like they do in academia, right? And I think if I had had 6 months, 10 months, 8 months, whatever, of a sabbatical, um, I might not have retired when I did. I absolutely positively needed to recharge my mental batteries. I needed to get my health back in order. And if I could have had that experience, I would have come back for a while. I don't know how much longer I would have, because I clearly wasn't ready to leave policing. So within a short period of time, I became an executive fellow for the National Institute of Justice in Washington, D.C., and worked directly for the director of NIJ, John Lobb, and spent a year doing that, mostly focusing on this idea of evidence-based policing and how to make it more real for practitioners. How to translate the ideas that were coming out of crime science and policing, the science of policing, into something that made more sense and was more easily digestible by practitioners and policymakers and community members. The What I consider to be the trinity of policing: cops, policymakers, and community. So I did that and had a great experience. Had a wonderful time. Grew to uh, even more deeply admire the professionals at NIJ and what they were about and the work that they were doing, and just had a great time doing
What
that.
year was that?
That was 2012, from 2011 through 2012, and then in
Mm.
2012, um, I got the job running the what was then called the Police Foundation, and we quickly changed it to the not quickly, but soon thereafter changed it to the National Police Foundation, and it is now known as the National Policing Institute,
Hmm.
the country's oldest nonpartisan, non-membership police research organization, founded in 1970 by the Ford Foundation. Has a great history in American policing. At one point in its history, all of the real seminal policing research came out of the Police Foundation, and um, then it kind of went into hibernation for a while and is back, I think, today operating, firing on all cylinders. It's doing a great job.
Mm. Mhm. And then with the Police Executive Research Forum, was that a part of this organization or an offshoot or a separate organization altogether?
So one of the great things that I found when I got to the foundation was that there were two employees still there. One had been there the day the doors opened in 1970. The other guy came within, I think, the first year. So they had this long understanding and experience and, more important, history with the foundation, which was important because a lot of the rationale, the decisions, the backstories of why things were created were just not written down anywhere, right? And this is early 70s. So the way it was explained to me and my understanding is in the early 70s. So the foundation gets established in 1970. The guy that was leading it at the time had been a former police commissioner for NYPD and felt that larger agencies needed a more um, specific membership group that was had a connection to science representing them, and he, along with others, then worked to create what is now known as PERF. And
Mm,
I think that's why it's called the Police Executive Research Forum,
mm,
and why it's membership. The Policing Institute is not a membership group, right? It is a science-based organization, and that's great, but there is real value in having a membership group, and that's what they did. So there is a close connection historically between the Policing Institute and PERF,
mm.
as I understand it.
And then y- the American Society for Evidence-Based Policing, is that its own organization?
It is. It's a nonprofit that was formed by a bunch of people that I am proud to say are friends of mine. And, the driving force behind that was Dr. Renee Mitchell, who at the time was a sergeant for the Sacramento Police Department that I had met at a meeting where it was kind of a week long or several day long focus group for California's Post on something. I'm not sure I can even remember what it was about. And she and I happened to be sitting next to each other, and we started talking about evidence-based policing. I was with the foundation at the time and was the American representative, I guess, or advocate or broker. I don't even know what the right term was for the Cambridge University's Institute of Criminology master's program in the UK. I was on their advisory board, and Larry Sherman, who is an American criminologist that one of the top criminologists on the planet, was running at the time. And so I talked to her about that. She um, uh, got started the program, ultimately got her PhD from Cambridge, and wanted to create this association. So the Police Foundation helped fund the early um, strategic meetings of a group of what are they refer to themselves as pracademics, but they're practitioners who believe deeply in this and have a lot of academic background. They were all working cops, and the American Society of Evidence-Based Policing was born, and so it is off to the races, and it's um, a flourishing organization. Has a annual conference this year. I think it is in Tucson, Arizona, um, next month, and I think its membership grows every year, and its impact grows every year. It's part of a constellation of policing folks in the UK, Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand who believe that you should use the best available evidence to drive your policing strategies, and that's kind of the underpinning of the philosophical underpinning of evidence-based policing. And these are all practitioner-driven entities, right? Cops run all these things, or people that have a direct connection to policing. And so I think it's clearly evidence-based policing is a movement. It's not just a philosophy. It is a global movement in many ways, and I think they're going to expand into some other non-English speaking countries very soon. So,
Is that practice adopted throughout law enforcement, or is it still
no,
relatively
no, not at
no?
all. Um, Again, if you go back and you really kind of examine the way we educate cops at every level, whether they're street cops or line supervisors, middle managers, or executives, there are skill sets that um, I think we've just completely ignored that if this was the private sector, we would not ignore because there would be a direct connection to a thing called profit, right? The bottom line.
Mhm.
Businesses innovate in large part because it's about making more money, right? There's a very clear connection between strategies, activities, and profit that does not exist in the private, I'm sorry, in the public sector. So there's a very clear line between strategies, practices, and profit that does not exist in the public sector. And that's a bit problematic, right? This idea of competition exists in the private sector and drives a lot of innovation. If you look at what's happening in the world of artificial intelligence today, there is clearly a race that companies are looking for a better way of doing things, and that not only it relates to products and services, but also about the development of their leadership in the organization. And that, unless you thoughtfully, I think, create that in government, just doesn't exist. So we don't have executive development programs that include, I think, adequately concepts like evidence-based policing, change management, managing the culture, crisis communication, um, et cetera, et cetera, right? All these things that you end up having to do as a police leader that you learn as you go, or you learn from your predecessors or your peers. And those are valuable contributions to this learning. But I think that we're not doing the leaders of the future service by ignoring the developmental skill sets that the private sector is using to drive their profitability. Around again, I'll go back to thinking strategically, developing strategic thinking and foresight, um, um, using the best available evidence, how to think about developing the culture, recruitment, et cetera, et cetera. You take your pick, right? There's a whole bunch of these things that they'll touch upon, certainly, but I don't think that we are focusing enough on the skills that police chiefs will need in the future. Artificial intelligence would be one. This is akin to what the U.S. military was doing for a long time. You'll hear many military leaders talk about this, that they were planning and developing leaders for the last war, right? They now
Right.
think very differently. They are now planning and developing leaders for the next war, for the future.
Mhm.
So instead of having a rear view mirror approach to looking at that world, they're looking out the windshield, right? And I think we should be doing the same thing in policing, that you can't forget the lessons of the past, but we should be thinking about the future and what are the skill sets we need. And I think evidence-based policing is one of those. When you have fewer people, you have to be more efficient and effective with what you do. When you are being um, uh, charged with bias, when people are claiming that your strategies and your activities are not fair, you have to have some way to defend yourself that is more objective. And one of those is we're following the science, right? And you, if you're a police chief doing this, you can't just bring your agency along. You have to bring the community along this evidence-based policing journey so that you get enough buy-in, you build a critical mass around the idea that as a community, as a governmental structure, we are going to use the best available evidence that we can find, that science can tell us, that relates to reducing crime and disorder. And I think when you start doing that, people are more accepting of certain strategies you may want to use, and you will be less inclined to follow strategies where there's no evidence that is effective, or there is clear evidence that what you're doing creates more harm than good in policing. And so I would say to police chiefs, look, at evidence-based policing is a prophylactic measure that you ought to engage in just to protect yourself, right? Just to protect the agency, if nothing else. It will increase your effectiveness. It will reduce crime if you do it right. But there, what's in it for you, chief, is you might keep your job longer, right?
Mm.
You might have
So,
less problems with the community if you do.
what's uh what's the approach if it isn't evidence based?
The way we've always done it.
And how's that? How's that different?
Well, the way we've always done it has no basis in whether it's effective or not. We think it does. All right. So, as human beings, we suffer a great deal from some maladies, perceptual maladies, I think, that turn into operational realities.
Mm,
So, one of those is that because something occurs, we think that causes something. All right. There's a difference between correlation
mhm,
and causation.
mhm,
And when we engage in policing strategies, and I've been guilty of this myself early in my career, we do something and crime goes down and we want to claim the victory, right? There's all kinds of reasons for us to do that. So we say it's our hotspot policing strategy. I don't know, whatever. That's probably a bad example because there is actually science behind that. But
mhm,
zero tolerance. We used to do the. Oh no, here's one that I was thinking about the other day that we used to do every year. For whatever reason, for years, all of the police departments in my county and the sheriff's department and my agency, one day a year, we would field everybody we could, and we would sit outside liquor stores or places that were the victims of armed robbery in the hopes that um, we would catch somebody doing an armed robbery somewhere, someplace. In my agency, that never once happened. We did this for years and it never happened. We were part of this big countywide thing. It never happened. We used to do these zero tolerance things. Everybody goes to jail for everything in the hopes that we would reduce crime. Crime may have dropped. We may have caught somebody doing an armed robbery. And then we say crime went down or we caught the guy because we were doing this. And when in fact, those are just coincidences, right? It's the
mhm,
correlation. Causation is the result, a determination of causation, I should say, is a result of doing an evaluation where you control for outside factors. And you
mhm,
say, we've eliminated or controlled for all of these other things. And the only thing that we did differently here was this. And therefore, we can link that thing we did to either an increase or decrease. It was effective or it was ineffective. There was an effect or there was no effect.
mhm,
And that means you have to understand a little bit about um, the science and scientific evaluations, the methodology, or you can claim that because we bought back all these guns, that crime went down. Maybe crime went down because the small number of people that were shooting each other all the time got killed or they got incarcerated. They're off the street. Had nothing to do with you buying back guns.
mhm,
So, but there's a lot of politics in crime, and sometimes things happen for political reasons, and it's an appearance. I just think policing is a more honorable um, endeavor and should tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth.
mhm,
It's a messy profession. It's a messy world out there, and sometimes things don't go well. Sometimes we make mistakes, but I think we can say, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, this is what we did, this is what we didn't do. This is how we know that what we did worked. This is how we know what we did not work. And my own experience is that when we um, openly talked about evidence-based policing in my community, and it was part of the testing process, you had to explain at every level above every promotional level within the agency a developmentally appropriate question or questions was around evidence-based policing, right? If you were a sergeant, it was different than if you were testing to be a deputy chief or something, right? It was very different kinds, but there were components in there of evidence-based policing. And I think that if we do those things, it is easier, and then do it externally too. It's much easier to say to the community, we're going to try this. We don't know if it's going to work, but here's the science behind it. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the rationale. This is what you're going to get out of it if it works. And if it doesn't work, we'll stop doing it. And you have to be able to do that. And that's how we framed we started an aviation program, and that's how we framed the rationale and the justification to the city council and got the authorization to buy a plane and start an aviation program, was that we had these key performance indicators where we said, if we show after a year that this is not working, we will stop it. You don't have to, we won't come to you and say, or you won't have to tell us to kill it. We will come to you and say, it doesn't work, and we're asking you now to deauthorize it, or whatever, the system was. That made selling things much easier, by the way, just from a nuts and bolts or practical standpoint. So I guess I've kind of lost the thread of your question.
Well, the question was, which you answered, was whether, like, what happens in the absence of evidence-based,
Yeah.
policing and strategies. And my next question is around a question that I actually had planned later, as it relates to um, technology. And what I think is challenging for me to think about, and I imagine it's challenging for police leaders, is being able to learn a subject that you're not familiar with, that's novel in a lot of ways, and then being able to not just learn it, but then put it into practice.
Right.
Seems like that would be a challenge, right? For a
It's a
lot of
huge,
people. I mean, if you ask me anything about science, I won't know how to answer it, right? And if you say, "Oh my gosh, we're going to have to learn math in order for you to solve these crimes," you know,
right. So
that would be hard,
no,
right? So,
well, and this is becoming a bigger issue, I think, in policing, as the world is getting more complicated and technology is becoming a fundamental underpinning of policing in so many ways now. We are rapidly moving to a different place. I want to go back to just for a second about, in the absence of good science about something, what do you do? Because it relates to this question about technology you just said. So cops know a lot about crime. Police chiefs know a lot about crime and disorder and organizational strategies and all that. And when you can't find any good evidence about the topic of what you're doing, then you just have to do the best you can, right? You either do what you've been doing, or you try to set up some of your own evaluation criteria to at least more deeply ask the question, is this working? And how do we define working, right? How do we define success? Is it successful? It depends. What are you trying to achieve, right? So I do think that at the end of the day, even if you don't understand evidence-based policing, or you don't have any good science around it, you can articulate out the outcomes you seek. Everybody can do that, right? Everybody can say, and sometimes it's hard to do, but if you keep whacking away at it, you will eventually come up with a clear outcome that you seek, and then you work backwards from that. And I think this is also the case with technology. All you have to do is go to one IACP conference and go out on the trade show floor to look at how fast technology is evolving, and how fast the most disruptive technology we have ever invented, ever, artificial intelligence, is making its way into policing. And it's doing so in a void of understanding on the part of leaders and practitioners, right? Very few of us understand AI very well. I'm convinced that the people developing it sometimes don't even understand some of the things, based on the things that you see them say in public settings about the behavior of the algorithms or what they've created. I think that can be a bit chilling, right? But it's where we're heading. So in the absence of that technical expertise, this is where membership groups or research groups or entities like the think tank that I'm involved with, the Future Policing Institute, I think become critically important to police leaders who have tough decisions that they've got to make every day about things. And whether those are body cameras or drones or data analytics, um, all of this stuff um, lends itself to this framework of establishing the outcomes you seek, achieving clarity on those, and then reaching out to others who have enough technical expertise to give you some sense of whether or not this technology will solve your problem, right? Policing is the policing is all about problem solving. It is a problem business, right? That's nobody calls the cops and says, "Hey, we're having a great day today. I thought maybe you could just stop by and we could just have like a cup of coffee or whatever." That just doesn't happen. You call the police when you're having a problem. The police get involved because there are problems. There are crime problems, social problems, whatever. Um, so working the technology challenges in front of police leaders today, in many ways, is not conceptually different than working a crime problem.
Mhm.
You may not know the answers, but you probably can find somebody who does know the answers.
Mhm.
And so I spend a lot of time thinking and talking about artificial intelligence these days. And very clearly, um, one of the things that we should immediately ask ourselves is what's the problem we're trying to solve before we engage the technology?
Mhm.
And then try to understand enough about the technology to know whether that'll work. I use a lot of AI products. I have no idea how they work. I mean, I can describe them conceptually to you a little bit, but it's all magic. I don't know. It's,
Right.
it's a magical process
Yeah.
to use a large language model like ChatGPT or Gemini or
Yeah.
Copilot or something. Who knows how that works?
Right.
But I think, um, for me, I would, if a police chief or a cop was asking me about ChatGPT, for instance, I'd probably say, well, why do you want to use it? What's the problem you're trying to solve? Okay, this is not your tool, or it is your tool to use. And do you understand the unintended consequences of you using that? Do you understand the pitfalls? Do you understand what can get you in trouble? Do you understand how this can go off the rails? Because as is the case with all technology, the technology just is, right? It's not good or bad. It just is. Cars are not good or bad. They just are. It depends on how you use them, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
A car can be a useful transportation um, tool to get you from point A to B, or you can use it to run people over, and it can be a murder weapon, right? So it depends on how you use it, and I think this is true for technology too. But I don't know that we're asking the right questions, and I don't know that we're thinking about how we embrace technology appropriately. It's my own personal belief that every police department should have in-house a police technologist. And if you're a bigger agency, that could be somebody whose entire job it is to be that they they may not be cops there, but they have lots of training in the science of technology, the actual technologies you're talking about, and the ethics of the technology, right? They understand it from soup to nuts. Maybe they're not writing code, but they understand how programmers think and work and all that. And then their job is to advise the policymakers inside the department, the decision makers, about here's the technology I think we should pursue. Here are the downsides, the upsides. How do we deal with this, et cetera. If you're not one of the bigger agencies, you can do that internally with a officer that you assign. So the Everett, Washington Police Department has an officer whose job, he is the innovation and technology officer, but he's the department technologist, right? This is Everett's a city of about 180,000 people, just north of Seattle. And so they're in a region that has a lot of technology. So this probably makes a lot of sense to them. But if you're in a smaller agency, you can still say to somebody, you have every police department has at least one person in it that really loves technology. It's just the way we are, right? There's always somebody who's kind of the technology nut that always is looking at stuff. And as a collateral duty, that's what they could do, right? They could focus on how do we understand where are the places we need to go to get the answers about what this stuff is? How do we think about it? And what are the questions that the bosses here should be asking about the ethics of using this, the unintended consequences, et cetera, et cetera. And if you're a real small agency, then maybe you pool your resources at the county level or the regional level, and you say, one of us has to have somebody like this, and why don't we all pool our support and or resources to train that person, and that person then becomes the regional technologist for all of us agencies in the county or the region, that any of us have the right and ability to call them and say, we're thinking about a new CAD system. What are the questions we ought to be asking? We're thinking about body worn cameras. What should we know? Like, one of the things that I think everybody that has purchased was an early adopter of body worn camera systems was probably, did we ask the question, what about storage costs enough, for instance, right? The question they would be, I think they should be asking today is, where's the um, industry going? Where's the technology going? Can we afford it? First of all, because it's not the acquisition cost so much as it is going to be the storage costs, right, that are challenged. But more importantly, are we creating a public expectation that we've collected all this footage and now we're going to do something with it? What are we going to do with it? Most agencies don't do anything with their footage until there's a problem. Then they go back and look at it.
Mhm.
But using AI, for instance, to create transcripts of all of that, once you get that stuff in writing, you make it amenable to analysis using a large language model, and it becomes a treasure trove of insight into what your people are doing, what the community is doing, how you're really operating. Is there alignment between your policies and the behavior on the street? Oh, those kinds of things can happen, but you gotta understand how to get from point A to B. And it's not that complicated, to be honest with you. You don't have to have gone to MIT, or Stanford and get a degree in computer science to do this. You just have to noodle on a little bit and watch some YouTube videos and, create a collaborative kind of relationship with people who are smarter about this. And every community has somebody inside the community that's super smart about this stuff, whether it's the IT director at the local hospital or the school district or someplace that police departments can reach out to and do that. And so I think you don't have to have the answers or know the answers as the chief, right? Most organizations are not set up that way. What that person at the top needs to know is, how do we find those answers? Who can we reach out to? Within the framework of policing, this provides an opportunity for what we might label as community policing, right? A collaborative approach to solving a problem. The IT director at your local school district, 9 times out of 10, is going to love playing with the cops and talking to them about his or her world that nobody seems to care about, right? And they get a chance to sit down with the command staff or the working cops and talk about whatever technology piece you're talking about. They eat that stuff up, right? So
Mhm.
I think creating um, partnerships and collaborations with the people and the resources you have already in your community or your region is just a matter of thinking outside the box a little bit. It's not difficult. It doesn't cost you anything. It's a phone call. It's a cup of coffee. It's a lunch, whatever, right? It's just
Mhm.
talking to people, because I do believe in this country, most people still have a burning interest in safe communities, and that they'd be willing to help if you just ask them
Mhm.
and don't give them crap about it,
Right.
when they tell you stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's what's interesting about this series and focusing on think tanks and pulling the curtain back a little bit about which what each of these groups are doing, really focus in a lot of different areas, and there are some common threads throughout all of them. But as a resource for law enforcement, I think it's a really important aspect of the law enforcement community. If a department cannot react as quickly to a situation, there are people, researchers, former law enforcement officers, who are focused on these specific issues and are available and accessible to police leaders. And
So yeah, Malcolm Gladwell in his first book, The Tipping Point, he's written another book that's just kind of a he refutes some of the things he said in the first book, but talks about one of some really interesting concepts. One of them is the value of connectors, right? The people that know a lot of people and will connect people up, right? And I think police chiefs have to be either they got to find the connector within their department that knows everybody, or they have to be the connectors for the department, right? Personally, I never once, not one time that I can think of, ever went to somebody in the community, whether they worked, like I said, the school district or other parts of the city or in a HOA or a businessman downtown and said, when I said to them, I have a problem and I think you can help me. Are you willing to at least talk to me about this and help me think this through? Not once did I ever have anybody say, I am not going to help you. That is
right.
not going to happen. Never happened. Never happened. Even with people who didn't like us,
Mhm.
right? I sat down when I got my head in the right place with people that were very vocally opposed to us and said, we clearly have a problem. How can you help me solve this problem? How can you get me smarter about this? And it changes the nature of that conversation immediately. But when you're not in that mode, you get all these people that are just want to be helpers, you know? It's like, who doesn't want to help make their town community safer? I just don't think we as police leaders think about that enough and fully um, appreciate the um, potential resources that we have in our communities to solve even traditional policing problems, right? But do it in a non-traditional way. And I think this is going to be one of the skill sets that police leaders have to develop in the future because policing is not getting less expensive, it's getting more. We're not having more people interested in being cops, we're having fewer. And the world is not getting less complicated, it's becoming more complicated. So our ability to reach outside the boundaries of our police organizations, I think, is going to become increasingly more important. We're going to have to think in a boundaryless way in terms of solving really pressing problems. And because technology is becoming so sophisticated and is evolving so fast, this is going to be probably one of the areas where I think is the easiest for police leaders to kind of delve into is to try to find some technology person that can help them better understand the stuff they're trying to do or to develop their own, right? The problem is there's I don't know of any places you can send your people to and to become police technologists, you know.
Mhm.
I,
Right.
I, that's part of the problem, right? We should
Mhm.
create that.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things we are in fact trying to do and create some kind of an online program, training program, at least get it started at the Future Policing Institute. We have a center on policing and artificial intelligence, and that's some of the work that the folks in the working group there are trying to do. So,
So that's a great segue into one of the reasons that we're here today, and that is to talk about the Future Policing Institute.
mm,
So tell us a little bit more about that organization and why you started it and what its purpose is.
sure. So the Future Policing Institute is a think tank. It's very much still in its startup mode, but its mission is to advance future policing that is effective, empathetic, and just. And so it's made up of about 100 people at this point that are some of the more thoughtful thinkers, more forward thinkers about policing. Most of them are from the United States. We have a few fellows that are from the UK and one from Australia. And it really came out of a class I took in the late 80s at the FBI National Academy when I was going through that program. And the class was, I think, called Futuristics in Law Enforcement. And it was for me, a very perspective altering experience. Until somebody invents a time machine, literally the rest of our lives is in the future, right? Um, Certainly, we have the present, like we are talking right now. But as soon as we end this, and by the time you publish this, it will be in the past. And so, for those of us who went through that class, it was taught by a guy by the name of Bill Tafoya, um, for to whom I think many of us owe a great deal to help change our perspectives. Um, that core group of people that were the alumni of his class, it's the only class you had to apply to, and there was not an automatic acceptance into it. I think changed everybody's lives that went through that in their perspective. So fast forward many years, that experience had affected me personally about how I think the people that worked for me and how I saw my role as a leader at the Redlands Police Department and then later at the what is now the National Policing Institute. And when I left there, I wanted to create some kind of an organization that focused very specifically on advancing the future of policing, using policing, futures research tools and this idea of strategic foresight in very practical terms to try to help the police um, think differently about tomorrow. As I said, all of our lives are really going to be lived tomorrow in the future by definition, but also policymakers and interested community leaders. So the kind of policing triad, I may have mentioned this earlier, but I think represents a healthy, positive, and pro-social approach to policing in any community is when the police, the policymaker, local policymakers, and community leaders are all pulling on the same end of the rope. Are they thinking about policing the same way? They don't have to agree, but are they all in agreement that they're going to collaborate and talk about what's the purpose of policing in our community? What does it look like? What are the things we should be working on? How do we best serve as guardians for the community? How do we make the community safer and sustainable in the future? So those are kind of, if you will, the markets that we aim to. But we are a think tank, so we think, right? We sit around and we talk a lot about stuff, but we also produce products. We produce briefs, articles, blog posts. We have a podcast now that's an experimental one called Policing in a Minute. Get it wherever you get your podcasts. And we will be releasing another one shortly called Future Policing, which is a more traditional podcast around, much like this. It's an interview format. Inside of the Institute is a thing called the Center on Policing and Artificial Intelligence. To the best of our knowledge, it's the only one right now in existence whose focus is on advancing policing's safe and responsible use of artificial intelligence. There are many places that talk about artificial intelligence, many centers. Most of those have a broader perspective. How does local government, how do schools, how does healthcare use AI? What does AI look like for everybody in the future? We have a very narrow view, which is about the police use of AI, or as some people just refer to it, police AI. What does that look like? It is the growth of AI is exponential. All of us use it every day, whether we recognize it or not. We will all be using it in much deeper and broader ways very soon. And I'm not sure, and this is why we created this, that policing fully appreciates the impact that it's going to have on society and then on policing itself. Um, the pace of AI evolution is far outstripping local governments, state legislatures, and Congress's ability to regulate it or legislate it. There's very clearly an AI arms race underway between the superpowers of the world, and there is very clearly an AI race underway between the big tech giants of this country. Those forces, the AI arms race, the competitive nature of companies developing AI means that they're moving very, very, very fast, much faster than we can appreciate the impacts of things. And certainly the regulation and legislation around those are so far behind the power curve, they can't even see it, I think. Um, so that's a component of it. We try very hard not to make AI the central focus of the institute. Policing is very much a people business. So the issues we discuss range from race in policing to use of force, leadership, organizational development, preventable error, um, climate change, preparedness, all kinds of things that we think the police ought to be thinking about and doing so in an anticipatory posture, right? Thinking about what are the implications for us. If you can envision these things in the future, in a future state, then you're able to identify the things you need to do to nudge your future into a more desirable state. Um, and so scenario planning is a part of futures thinking. This idea of developing strategic foresight is key to it, and being anticipatory and forward leaning, right? Thinking about what does policing look like for us in the next few years. Our time horizon is not real long. I've been involved in many long range futures projects where we develop scenarios and think about what policing might be in 2050 or 2060, for instance. And I find those to be fascinating thought experiments, but I don't know how useful those are for practitioners who themselves will probably be out of the business sometime in the next 5 to 10 years. So our time horizon is right now, the end of the decade, 2030. What does policing look like? What are the trends and events that policing should be preparing for between now and 2030 is kind of what our time horizon is.
How did you go about forming the organization? What were some of the first steps?
Well, the formation of this really began, um, boy, a long time ago, maybe 20 years or so ago. I've been thinking about this for a long time. While I was at the um, National Police Foundation, now National Policing Institute, this was on my list of things that I hope that we would accomplish, was to create kind of a not a separate organization, but a capacity and a mechanism by which thoughtful people could discuss what policing should look like in the future and how we get there and how we understand the forces at play that might mitigate what we're trying to achieve or facilitate those things. But that didn't happen. I was able to start a project at the Police Futures International, which is the only other police futures group in the United States, and the institute, the future or the National Policing Institute, completed, and that they produced a guidebook. It's on their website. It's on our website. But then after I left there, I started doing some consulting and actually acquired the URL in 2019 after I left the institute, and was intending to start it then. Consulting got in the way, and next thing I know, fast forward, and it's like 2013 going into 2014, and I decided if this was ever going to happen, I had to focus more intently on it and stop consulting. So I essentially stopped most of my consulting practice and then focused on this. We launched in early 2014, have really only had been operational for now about a year. The first meeting that we held, we determined that there was a complete lack of policy for police agencies around the use of large language models like ChatGPT, right? And I think this is still the case. So that was our first project. We created a model policy for the use of AI in policing, and it's up on our website under the resources page. Go to futurepolicing.org if you want to see it. But it was pretty simple. I mean, there were mechanical issues or logistical issues about, calling people and talking to them about what this looks like and having them collaborate on the initial launch of it. Like I say, creating the website and doing that. And those are just mechanical kind of, process things you have to do. The bigger issue was first trying to determine, was there an appetite for this? Did the most thoughtful leaders that I could get my hands on, that people I had met along the way in my career, think that the idea of creating a future policing think tank made sense to them? Would it make sense to the field? And the answer was a resounding yes. And if you look at the people that are participating in this, you'll recognize many of them have national reputations. It's a pretty diverse group in terms of their backgrounds and gender and ethnicity, which is not what we were necessarily aiming for. It just, these are the people that know a lot about policing. So that's just the way it kind of ended up. Although I have to say that these are very important issues to me, because what we didn't want to do was build an echo chamber, right, for our thoughts. So we wanted, and we're still looking for, I think, more thoughtful people that disagree with much of what I think about policing or others may think about it, so that we add to the richness of that discussion. And then we just launched. We just did it. I think we can plan ourselves to death sometimes, and I have a pretty high tolerance for ambiguity. So I didn't have to know exactly what we were doing to launch it. We just needed to have enough of a frame so that it made sense when people went to the website, or made sense for us, and that's what we did. And so we're developing it all the time. It is very much like a startup that is furthering the development of its products and services. We have a AI working group that is currently working to create a roadmap for the Center on Artificial or Center on Policing and Artificial Intelligence. And we hope that we'll expand those products and services to help the police and policymakers and community members better understand, and then ultimately implement, a safe and responsible use of AI. And those two words, safe and responsible, there's a lot going on there and a lot to unpack. There's a lot of stuff going on with AI that I think we, as both a species, need to better understand, but certainly as people interested or involved in policing need to understand, so that we use it effectively and do not create more harm than benefit as we do it. And so the mission of the Center on Policing and AI is connected to the mission of the Future Policing Institute, which is, again, this idea that we can advance policing in a manner that ensures that it's effective, empathetic, and just. And each of those words has tremendous implications for how the police go about doing their business, what they think about their purpose, and how we measure their success.
What role do the fellows play, and how do you manage a group of that size? And
Well, it can be a challenge. We have divided the group up into 3 cohorts so that we can manage the conversations. We drive a lot of what we do through monthly conversations that we have with the fellows around a topic.
Mhm.
I don't know when this is going to air, but the topic that we'll be discussing in April is the future of mass demonstrations in the United States. We give them a topic, we give them a prompt, and in this case, I think we're going to be trying to explore, what did we learn from the demonstrations that occurred during the COVID pandemic, after the George Floyd killing. What did we learn from that? What policing learned from those things? And do we believe that we're going to see more mass demonstrations in the near future? Or what do we think about that idea? Those conversations then turn into products, whether they're blog posts or articles or webinars or whatever we do. But this process is designed to get some of the most thoughtful, forward-thinking people in the country to think about a specific topic in policing, and then turn that into something that practitioners, policymakers, and community people will use. So our products tend to be shorter as opposed to longer. They're all written and produced in plain language. We try to avoid jargon where we can. And they're all intended to give you a new perspective on something, but then also something you can do about it, some action you can take. So these aren't just thought pieces. There's actionable um, suggestions in there that police chiefs, sheriffs, mayors, city managers, whoever can go back and try to apply to their local circumstance. Managing that group of people is a joy, and it's not hard because they're great people. The difficulty in that is just the logistical piece. How do you get that many people in these three same places every month to be able to talk about stuff? And then what do we do with their thoughts? How do we take their thoughts and turn them into something that is a product? So, but that's just logistics and process, right? That needs to be done. It's not all that difficult. The more involved part that I enjoy the most, by the way, is speaking to new people that are very thoughtful and recruiting them as fellows, and then trying to figure out what this amalgamation of their thoughts looks like in a way that if I was still on the job, if I was still a police chief, or if I was a lieutenant or a sergeant or a cop on the street, how would I use that? How would that make sense? And that's the podcast that we have is just the one that's out now, Policing in a Minute. It's just a audio podcast, and it's designed to be very short episodes. They're like 2 minutes long, and we take a large amount of research that we can find and distill maybe 1,000 pages of research into what are the three most important points you need to know about hotspots policing, for instance. Or there's a tool you use, a conceptual tool that you use with hotspots policing called the Koper curve. How does that play out, and what does that mean, and what's that look like? It's very difficult to take a complicated subject, trust and confidence in the police, leadership, whatever it is, and distill it down to three main points. But people involved in policing have very little time. They're very, very busy people who are dealing with lots of organizational, personnel, budgetary, political spot fires in the here and now, right? They're dealing with things today. If they don't deal with that spot fire today, it turns into a big forest fire, right? And gets completely out of control. So they have to deal with that. But so they don't have a whole lot of time to think strategically, which I think is perhaps one of the biggest challenges for police leaders in this country today, is finding enough time to think strategically about where their agency is going, what is the true purpose of policing in their community, et cetera, and then apply whatever. So I think the Future Policing Institute, one of its goals is to try to be that distillery, if you will, of these wonderfully brilliant people and their thoughts, and turning that into something that is meaningful for a patrol sergeant, let's say, or a police chief who can print something off or say to his or her command staff, read this article, it's short, and we're going to talk about it. What are the implications around extreme weather, for instance, in policing? And, climate change can be controversial for people. So even though that may be the title of, or the label we use, that's not really what we're talking about. We're talking about extreme weather and the implications it has. I live in Southern California and not far from Los Angeles, and we just saw in January the devastating effects of a drought followed by hurricane level winds when a fire starts, and thousands of homes were burned in the Pacific Palisades, or in a place called Altadena, which is just north of Pasadena, killed a bunch of people, etc. In Houston, there was a hurricane, and there's a phenomenon called the rapid intensification of hurricanes, and that happened there. And a patrol sergeant, if I recall his rank correctly, in uniform, on duty, drowned in his police car in an underpass, where he got stuck in the water and he drowned in the car. So these things are real, right? Anybody who lives in the central part of the United States or the Southeast, I don't need to tell them about hurricanes or tornadoes and what the impact that has on policing. So that's why that's there, right? That really doesn't have anything to do directly with AI, but that's an example of what we think policing should think about. And that's also why For instance, we have a section on preparedness and thinking about how do you make sure that your officers' families are prepared for disaster and your officers are comforted by the knowledge that their families are safe so that they will stay on the job during a disaster or they will come in if they're off duty. And I think we saw this in New Orleans during Katrina, the impact of a disaster on the workforce. So those are the kinds of things we talk about and try to do that. I'm digressing a little bit, but there isn't any aspect, I think, of policing or really our society that doesn't lend itself to a discussion about the future and what are those trends, events, things that we can identify in the near future that are going to affect that issue. And if we can identify them, then we can nudge our future into a more desired place through trying to mitigate those issues or events or trends, or trying to facilitate their contribution to the policing success. But you first have to figure out what those ideas are, what those issues are, what is the impact of the current administration's focus on immigration going to be, for instance. That's an identifiable event in our country that's underway right now. And it has future implications, probably on the positive side of the agenda or the ledger and on the negative side as it relates to trust and confidence. Controlling our borders is on the positive side, getting rid of criminals that have arrived here illegally and then is positive. And then the negative issue here is what does that do to the police relationship with those populations? Because the police, at least up to this point in our country's history, don't check your immigration status when they are investigating the fact that you're a victim of crime or you need, police assistance. So there are implications there that we can identify, and then we can help policing agencies nudge their own desired future by affecting some change or reacting to those factors once they've been identified.
Are those monthly meetings open to the public, or are they?
No, they're not. These are closed. They're very candid. People have freedom to say whatever they want to in these meetings. I think it's important for me to protect their anonymity so that they're very candid about things. These are very blunt conversations about whatever we're talking about. And then it's up to me and some others to try to distill the essence there. And if there's a lot of emotion involved, and sometimes there is, then we try to set that aside and just focus on what's the issue, what are the facts, what can we talk about. Immigration I'll go back to that again for just a second, is a really hot button item in this country, and it can engender very strong emotions from people on either side of that particular issue. And I get all of that. Our job, as I see it, is to try to separate the policing issues in there from the emotion and say, here are clear connections between that issue and the policing experience in an attempt to try to help police leaders and other practitioners understand what the dynamics are so that they can then make a decision what's best for them and their community about how they proceed, whether to mitigate that influence or try to use it to facilitate their success.
So going back to climate change,
Mhm.
so if the future policing institute and or law enforcement agencies and departments identify something that's occurring that is impacting law enforcement, like climate change or mental health, let's say a hospital closes in a community, right?
Right.
What happens next? Public health issues, so things that impact law enforcement because it means they have to do their job differently in some way, or there's an issue that just hasn't impacted them in the same way yet. What's the next step after that? Does law enforcement have a role in terms of supporting legislation that would help to reduce the effects of climate change? Or, how does law enforcement lobby on
Yeah.
behalf of itself?
Well, so I think this is a very complicated question you're asking, and I'll give you probably what is not such a satisfying answer. I think it depends on where you are in your local political circumstances. Police chiefs, especially, try very hard to be apolitical, right? They try not to get involved in the political debate about something. They're not always successful in doing that, and sometimes they do have to wade in to the issue. Climate change is a very controversial subject for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who don't believe it's a thing, and there are a lot of people who believe it is a big deal and may represent the end of human existence eventually. I think for us, what is more helpful and useful is even using a slightly different term, which is extreme weather, right? So whether we believe it's caused by climate change or not,
Mhm.
most people can agree that there are extreme weather events that have implications for the police. If you were to talk to LAPD or the sheriff's department, they will tell you that they had an absolute experience where extreme weather impacted their operations for about a week, right? Where they were dealing with fires that they could not control, that were unlike anything they had ever seen in Southern California. The cause of that, the bigger, broader cause, people can debate, I guess. We try not to get involved in that if we can, and still talk about the implications for policing. And it can be, as simple as, do your people have the right personal protective gear to deal with a fire? Do your people have the right training to even understand the fire behavior in what is essentially a wildland fire? We had a big one when I was still on the job in the city next to us and up in the mountains. My town is located at the base of these very large mountains in Southern California. And we sent a couple of our officers over to help um, with the neighboring agency in evacuations and security while the fire was blazing through these neighborhoods. And I talked to a couple of these folks when they came back, and I said, "Well, what was it like?" And they said, "Well, first of all, we almost died." I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, we didn't understand the behavior of the fire. We were back up in these neighborhoods. We didn't know where we were. We didn't understand the neighborhoods. We're not familiar with them. And the fire was moving so fast because of the winds that were 70, 80 miles an hour. We got trapped in this area where all of the houses were burning, all the palm trees and everything were burning, things were exploding around us, and we didn't know how to get out of there. And we eventually got out. I can't remember how they did it. A cop from that city found them, or they stumbled their way out. This is exactly what happened to an Oakland cop many years ago up in the hills of Oakland when they had a similar fire, and he got disoriented, lost, and he died in his police car. He got burned up. So these are the more practical implications about extreme weather. Are you preparing them for this? Are you preparing for, first of all, what is the rapid intensification of a hurricane? What does that concept even mean? What are the implications for you? And how do you deal with those? Especially if you are dealing with a phenomena that you hadn't seen before. If you grew up in the Midwest, let's say in an area that has had tornadoes forever, you probably don't need specific training around tornadoes because you've seen them. But if you are working and living in Southern California, you probably have zero understanding or experience of tornado behavior. A couple months ago in the LA area, we had several tornadoes, not the kind that devastate communities in the Midwest, but just the fact that we had identifiable, measurable tornadoes in Southern California tells me that things are a bit different. And so I don't know what kind of training they gave the cops or even talked about it, but um, these are the kinds of things that'll keep cops alive and help them be more effective. So we try to stay out of all the political. So that's an example, right, of a issue that got a lot of politics around it that we really try to stay out of. That's not our interest. We're not a political organization. We're agnostic about politics. What we care about are the impacts and the effects, and to the extent that we can identify them, the indisputable facts or factors around whatever the issue happens to be. Um, Race and policing would be another example that's just full of politics, and you don't have to I think, wade into the political discussion to be able to acknowledge that there is a racial component to policing, right? And that's multifaceted, that relates to the history of policing in this country, current events, and from our view, more importantly, in the future, how we're going to deal with the tension around the racial tension around policing and police use of force, and et cetera.
So is that where an organization like the Fraternal Order of Police, other associations, where they're in effect advocating for law enforcement as it relates to some of these issues?
Yeah, yeah. So those membership groups are very different than what we are. We're a non-membership, nonpartisan think tank. And these other groups have identifiable constituencies, whether those are union members or police chiefs or sheriffs, very clear that that's who their primary constituency is, and very clear that that's who they're advocating for and whose interests they're looking out for. In those discussions around the interests of sheriffs or police chiefs, for instance, is going to clearly be the interests of policing overall, and frequently the future of policing. But because they have an identifiable constituency, I think they're much better positioned to lobby Congress or to lobby legislators or take political stands, because that's what their membership is demanding of them, right? Is to be the voice, especially on national issues, about how police chiefs or sheriffs or union members feel about a particular issue. And I think those are very important voices. They're very important um, organizations in the great mosaic that makes up American policing, but it's not what we do, and it's not the role that we play. Um, Ours is a more agnostic view of what's going to affect policing tomorrow. How do we identify it? How do we move toward that better policing model? I believe that as taxpayer funded entities, policing agencies need to constantly, and their leadership needs to be constantly trying to figure out how to improve their operations and, build a better mousetrap, if you will, because they're not spending their own money. It's not like a business where you can spend your money any way you want and to try to make a buck. When you're spending the taxpayer money, I think you have to be a good steward of that and try to say, how do we improve our operations? How do we become more effective? How do we become more efficient? How do we spend less money? How do we improve our services, et cetera, et cetera? I don't know that that happens enough, simply because policing is a monopoly in this country. When you don't get a choice, when you call 911, you don't get a voicemail message that says press 1 for the police department, 2 for the sheriff's department, or 3 for the state police. You get whoever's the PSAP is, and when you call 911, and that's who's going to show up. And that can, without very intentional actions on the part of the leadership, I think create some challenges. And it's easy to get complacent in policing, certainly on the street. I have lots of experiences with myself becoming tactically complacent in instances. Fortunately, I didn't get killed. And as a leader, organizationally, you can become complacent too at times.
Yes, I don't mean to get us off track. I was trying to connect the
Sure.
dots between, what I imagine you all are doing in terms of identifying risks and things that are going to be happening in the future, based on the work that you all are doing, and then what happens then right after that. How do you connect it, so that you can mitigate the risk,
And that's really up to the leadership, right? I mean,
yeah.
whether it's IACP or PERF or major city chiefs or national sheriffs or the Policing Institute or RAND, or take your pick, right? There's a lot
Right.
of these great organizations, you guys, um, that are doing fabulous work and producing fascinating, valuable information. You can't make anybody do anything with that. You offer
Mhm.
it up, you try to make the
Mhm.
case as to why this will increase officer safety and wellness, but somebody still has to do it, right? The police
Mhm.
leaders have to implement the program or the concept, and you start with the first step of that particular journey is making a intentional decision that you're going to constantly try to improve the operation.
Mhm. Yeah. So you said you guys are looking at policing up to 2030?
That's our time horizon now. We'll adjust
Yeah.
that. I think we're trying to look out 5 to 6 years, as we think is a reasonable time horizon. The farther out you go, the squishier things get,
Mhm.
and I think less useful in many places in this country, maybe even nationally. I'm not sure what that average is, but for instance, in California, police chiefs, the average tenure of a police chief in California is like 3 to 5 years. So if we're talking to people today about the future, we better be talking about a time horizon that's rational for not only them, but also the people coming up behind them, right? Their number twos, their successors. If we are talking about something 30 years out, let's say, again, really, really interesting discussions. And I will jump into those any day of the week, but less practical because you're not talking about the current leaders being in place in 30 years. You're not talking about their successors being in place in 30 years. You're talking about 3 or 4 chiefs after the successor
Mhm.
will be in office sometimes, depending on where they are. Some places have a much higher churn rate of police chiefs. During the time that I was the one police chief in my hometown, the city next to us was on their 6th police chief just as I was leaving.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that shows you that if you're trying to produce things that the leadership of any particular agency find useful, you better have a tighter time frame, I think, than a longer one. And also the farther out you go, the harder it gets to forecast technological developments. You can listen to the people who know a lot about AI, for instance, today, and listen to them discuss artificial general intelligence, AGI, which is like it's connected to super intelligence. It's the point at which we will not be able to determine algorithms from human thinking, right? It's a very advanced thing. And many of the people, the loudest, clearest, I think, and most authoritative voices around AI are talking about that occurring probably by the end of the decade. So if you're talking about that kind of advance of that incredible technology just in the next 5 years,
Mhm.
how are we going to be able to envision what's happening
Sure.
25 years from now or 30 years from
Mhm.
now? I think it's important to have these kind of broad discussions, but if you're doing that, then you better be bringing in the rookies for those discussions, because those are the
Mhm.
people that will be the leaders in 30 years. It isn't you guys. It is the boots that just came into the organization who are still trying to figure out how not to crash their police car and get in trouble with their sergeant. So that may be a
So,
little complicated.
yeah, baby steps. Were you always interested in technology and in AI, or was this something that
Well,
you
I've always been interested in technology. I wasn't a technocrat, I don't think, and certainly not a technologist. Wasn't interested in AI until the last several years because it really wasn't a thing. But I've always been a bit of a gadget geek and a propeller head, and just somebody who is interested in how this stuff could be used. I don't know. I'm not interested in programming or building a computer from scratch and that kind of stuff. To me, it's just all magic. Whatever happens in my smartphone, I have no idea how that works. It's just magic. I am interested, though, in how I can use it or how the police can use that smartphone and what the implications are for that. What are the ramifications? What are the intended consequences? And what are the and I find this fascinating, what are the unintended consequences of producing something like, let's say, a taser, right? A super useful tool for controlling out of control people. That's the intended consequence. What's the unintended consequences? That some people are going to abuse it. And now you create a whole nother issue with that. Or you can look at body cameras the same way. The intended consequence, I think, for a lot of people of that was um, police accountability, reduction in use of force, et cetera. And that certainly, I think there's enough evidence that that has occurred. But for in a lot of places, what it has done is actually support the police position that most of the time we do the right things and we're really good people. We're not trying to abuse people. Those people who didn't like the police, who saw cameras as the technological savior of these oppressive people called the cops, are probably not too thrilled with body cameras in some ways. They may not acknowledge that, but I think that they were a bit disappointed that there weren't more accountability measures or police reform measures as a direct result of the cameras. You know, you saw this shift from cops who didn't want cameras originally to now the officers I interact with or talk to, or the chiefs I interact with, and their people say that they absolutely want them and they don't want to hit the street without them because that's how they protect themselves from claims that they did something inappropriate. So that's the kind of stuff that I think I'm really interested in. And how that applies to policing is I think important. And I probably drove the people in my agency nuts, but we were highly innovative. We would try almost anything if it made sense. You know, if we could find a way to fund it, if we could identify the potential harm and mitigate that and identify the potential benefit, we would try just about anything. And so we did a lot of stuff. We were the first agency in the country to issue all of its field people, civilians and cops, iPhones when they first came out, for instance. That was a challenge to get past the politicians who thought that they were just luxury items. But I think anybody who has a smartphone today, especially in policing, recognizes that we call them phones, but that's only one of the functions. It's much more like one of these handheld devices that you saw in Star Trek, right? In the early days that did everything, right? Now things are capable of doing real-time language translation, biometrics, facial recognition, all things AI. I mean, they're cameras, they're recorders, they're notifications, but take your pick, right? These are not phones. We just continue to call them that. So I'm fascinated by all of those things.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, those are the technical things I'm fascinated in. The less technical things I think that are really speak more to like the spirituality of policing. And I do believe in the spirituality of policing. I believe in the nobility of policing, are things like, how do we determine the purpose of policing? What is the meaning and the purpose of policing overall in my community and for me if I'm a cop? What is the purpose of my being a cop? Right? I think these are fundamental, almost metaphysical questions that have to be answered. We're currently seeing, for instance, a lot of, it's become a little bit trendy to say, what's your why? You know, as an individual, what's your why? You know, or from an agency standpoint, what's the agency's why? And I really think that means is, you know, what's your purpose? What's your purpose of being a cop? What's your purpose of being a police department? What does the community think your purpose is? What do they want your purpose to be? What do you think it is? And going through that process. And I think that's very powerful. And we had a disciplinary model that I used to refer to as restorative discipline in my agency, where we made this very quick threshold decision about what you were alleged to have done was either so egregious that you were going to go down a path that might result in termination, or we weren't going to terminate you. You were going to still be here. How do we restore your career, your standing in the organization and the damage you may have done to the organization so that the rest of your career is positive? And when you leave the career, when you finally retire, you look back and say, this was the greatest job in the world. I am so fortunate to have done that. And a lot of people don't get this, but policing is very hard on itself. You know, the agencies are very hard on the people that work inside of them. And so thinking about that, I think, is directly connected to purpose. So I would ask all of the people that were experiencing, they'd stub their toe, so we were holding them accountable. They had to have some discipline. We would do a Skelly hearing where they had an opportunity to tell us their side of the story before the imposition of discipline. And the question I would consistently ask them is, what do you think the purpose was of you becoming a cop? And just get back to a basic thing. Why are you a cop? What is it you want to do? And when you're clear on that and we work through that issue, then the next question is, the behavior you exhibited here, is that consistent with why you became a cop? And the answer was always, almost, maybe always, no. Great. So that's the first step, is recognizing that what I did is inconsistent with my own self view of why I became a cop. It's certainly inconsistent with what our collective view of our department is and what the purpose of that department is. And then how do we hold you accountable and not destroy you, right? Not end your career, not make your career so distasteful for you that you're angry for the rest of it, right? Because I hope for everybody who becomes a cop in this country that they experience the career and then leave the career at whatever point, for whatever reason, that they still look back and say, this was the greatest job in the world. And I am blessed to have had the opportunity to serve my community as a cop.
Mm.
So, but that, that builds on all kinds of things. And that speaks to leadership obligations, that speaks to the purpose of policing, organizational agreement and consensus about why are we here? What is just our job? It's not about the paycheck. You don't get paid enough to do the stuff you have to do. I don't care how much you're getting paid and where you are. So there has to be other reasons for that, right? And that speaks to recruitment and retention and promotion and rewards and accountability. It's just all the people side of policing, I think, are encapsulated in that. But all of those have a direct connection to the future of policing. And so for us, that's how we think about it. The purpose is really tied to what does our policing experience look like tomorrow in this community? What is our commitment to the community? I'm a big fan of applying a form of the Hippocratic Oath to policing. So I did some work with a group called Police to Peace that we created a thing called the Peace Officer Promise, and it really is just the application of the Hippocratic Oath to policing. I think that's fundamentally important to the relationship that a police department has with the people the cops are paid to protect. Being able to say to the community, much like a physician, I've taken a vow to above all try to do no harm to you as a community while I'm trying to protect you and solve crime and control disorder. We're going to do everything we possibly can not to harm you in that process. And that's what you hope a physician would be doing with that piece of the Hippocratic Oath, where they are admonished, above all, do no harm to your patient. While they're trying to cure the patient, don't harm them, right? And I think that there's direct applicability to that, and found in that question about what's our purpose. That's what's our why, kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning Police to Peace. That's a really great organization. And
it is. And by the way, I just will say that it's Police to Peace is about the idea that cops are guardians, and that police departments can be about the facilitation of peace. I'm not talking about holding hands and singing kumbayas with the bad guys. I'm not talking about wearing tie-dye t-shirts and, peace battalions, peace medallions. But if you look at the legislative language in the overwhelming majority of our states, the word or the phrase peace officer is how by statute cops are referred. In my state, California, you don't find police officer, law enforcement officer, et cetera. It's all peace officer is the term. That's the legislative term. That is the case in about 70% of the states. And in about 80% of the states, it's either the only term they use or it's one that they use interchangeably. So I think there's a kind of a fundamental question here about, why did the legislatures decide that cops should be known generically as peace officers? And what are the implications for us today? And how do we be peace officers at the same time we're attempting to control crime and disorder, right? I think, and that speaks more directly to what cops do every day. If you were to diagnose, most cops in most cities spend most of their time on things other than enforcing the law. They do a lot of that, but they also do a lot of conflict resolution. They do a lot of preventative actions. They do a lot of community engagement and administrative things, et cetera. And yet we've called them law enforcement officers, which again, I still use that term. I don't mean to belittle that term at all. But when we're talking about purpose, right, does that capture the true purpose? We do so much more than just enforce the law, but that's the term we use right now. So,
Well, Jim, thank you. This has
so
been
it's been a pleasure to chat with
an
you.
excellent discussion. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I really appreciate all your time.
So it's my pleasure. And, I would be remiss if I didn't give us one more plug. For anybody who's interested in the future of policing, go to futurepolicing.org. You can contact us off the info thing. And if you're interested in the future of artificial intelligence and policing, you can either go to cop-ai.org, or you can go to the section of our website at futurepolicing.org and click on the Center on Policing and Artificial Intelligence to get resources and commentary. As I said, you can always communicate with us on the info part of the website, and I will get back to you. I'm the guy who answers those questions. So
Perfect. Awesome.
thanks
Thank you,
a lot.
Jim. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Have a great day.
We hope you found this conversation enlightening and will join us again for another edition of Icons, where we introduce listeners to incredible people working within law enforcement who have had a profound impact on the community. These one-on-one interviews provide insight into their lives and careers so we can better understand their challenges and recognize their bravery, commitment, and sacrifice. The Icon series is not just about contemporary figures in the law enforcement community, but about all those who have served their communities and the world, from now and in the past. Be sure to tune back in with us for future Icons episodes to learn about key figures in American law enforcement history. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.